The husband was so ashamed of his wife that he introduced her as a maid. Years after the divorce, he is shocked to hear someone calling his name. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching this video from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Enjoy the story, everyone. The crystal chandelier sparkled above the exclusive dining room of the Carlton, where New York's elite gathered nightly to see and be seen. Henry Blackwood sat at his usual corner table, swirling an aged bourbon in a crystal tumbler, his sharp grey eyes surveying the room with practiced disdain. At 42, Henry had conquered Manhattan's real estate market with ruthless efficiency, turning Blackwood Properties into one of America's most formidable development companies. "Another acquisition today, I hear," said Brian Vasquez, sliding into the seat opposite Henry. Brian, Henry's oldest friend and business partner, signaled to the waiter for his usual scotch on the rocks. "The old textile factory in Brooklyn?" Henry's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "The owners practically begged me to take it off their hands. They didn't even realize the area's been approved for rezoning. I'll turn it into luxury condos and double my investment within 18 months. The Henry Blackwood magic touch." Brian raised his glass in mock salute. "Though I do wonder if there's anything you couldn't acquire if you set your mind to it." "Nothing and no one," Henry replied with absolute certainty, his gaze drifting to an attractive woman at the bar who had been stealing glances at him all evening. "Business or pleasure, it's simply a matter of strategy and persistence." Brian followed Henry's gaze and chuckled. "Your reputation precedes you. But I wonder—" He paused, swirling the ice in his drink thoughtfully. "Wonder what?" Henry turned his attention back to his friend, one eyebrow raised. "If there's a challenge even the great Henry Blackwood couldn't win." There was something playful yet calculating in Brian's tone that piqued Henry's interest. "Try me," Henry challenged, leaning forward. The alcohol had created a pleasant warmth in his chest, amplifying his natural confidence to dangerous levels. Brian's eyes glinted. "My sister, Olivia." Henry nearly choked on his bourbon. "Olivia, the bookish one with the glasses who's always protesting something or other." He had met Brian's younger sister only a handful of times over the years. His lasting impression was of a plain, serious woman in sensible shoes who had barely acknowledged his existence, preferring to hide behind her books and causes. The very same. Yale graduate, professor of environmental ethics at Columbia, and the leading voice behind that coalition that's been giving your Brooklyn development so much trouble in the press. Henry's jaw tightened. The Heritage and Community Preservation Alliance had indeed been a thorn in his side, rallying local support against his plans to demolish the historic textile factory. He hadn't realized Olivia was involved. "What about her?" he asked, his voice cooling. "Marry her," Brian said simply, his face betraying no hint of jest. Henry stared at his friend for a long moment before bursting into laughter. "Have you gone completely mad? Why on earth would I marry your activist sister?" "For 6 months," Brian clarified, ignoring Henry's outburst. "A business arrangement, shall we say. If you can make Olivia fall in love with you, genuinely fall in love, within that time, I'll sell you my shares in the Central Park West project." Henry's laughter died abruptly. The Central Park West development was potentially their most lucrative venture yet, a complete renovation of a historic building into ultra-premium apartments. Brian's 25% stake was worth millions. "And if I fail?" Henry asked, his business mind already calculating risks and returns. "You donate $1 million to Olivia's Environmental Foundation." Brian smiled. "No strings attached." "This is absurd," Henry scoffed, but the competitive gleam in his eye betrayed his interest. "Olivia detests everything I stand for. She wouldn't agree to this farce." "Oh, I think she might," Brian countered. "The foundation is struggling for funding, and $1 million would secure their operations for years. Besides, she's practical enough to recognize a mutually beneficial arrangement." Henry narrowed his eyes. "You've already discussed this with her, haven't you?" Brian shrugged. "Let's just say I've tested the waters. She finds the idea distasteful but not impossible, given the potential benefit to her cause. And what exactly would this marriage entail? A legal ceremony? Cohabitation? Public appearances as a couple? The works. Enough to convince society, and me, that it's a genuine attempt. As for private arrangements between you two," Brian waved his hand dismissively, "that's for you to negotiate." Henry drummed his fingers on the table, mind racing. The challenge was preposterous, Yet he couldn't deny the thrill it sparked. Olivia Vasquez, with her sensible cardigans and moral superiority, had always looked through him as if he were invisible. The idea of bringing such a woman to heel, making her fall for him despite her principles, it would be his greatest conquest. "And how will we determine if she's genuinely fallen in love?" Henry asked, the strategist in him needing clear parameters. "I know my sister," Brian said confidently. "She's incapable of pretense when it comes to emotions. If she falls, it will be obvious to anyone who knows her." He paused. "Besides, at the end of 6 months, she would have to freely choose to remain with you without financial incentive." Henry took another sip of his bourbon, considering. It was madness, yet the businessman in him recognized the favorable odds. He had never failed to charm a woman when he set his mind to it, not even once in his 42 years. Surely Olivia Vasquez, despite her intellect and principles, was not immune to the attentions of a wealthy, powerful man. 6 months of my life for your stake in Central Park West," Henry mused aloud. "Against $1 million I'd barely miss." "Exactly," Brian nodded. "Though I suspect your pride values the victory more than the financial gain." Henry's eyes hardened at the subtle challenge. "Fine, I accept your wager, but I want something clear from the outset. No interference from you. This plays out between Olivia and me, without your meddling." "Agreed." Brian extended his hand across the table. "Though I doubt any meddling would help you in this case. My sister is formidable." Henry gripped his friend's hand firmly. "Every fortress has its weakness, Brian, even your sister's." As they sealed their bargain, Henry didn't notice the tall, elegant woman who had been seated within earshot for the past 15 minutes. Camilla Winters, society columnist for the New York Chronicle, quietly signaled for her bill, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. New York's social scene was about to become infinitely more interesting. The following afternoon found Henry in his penthouse office atop the gleaming Blackwood Tower in Midtown Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city's skyline, a daily reminder of his position at the pinnacle of the city's power structure. He sat behind his desk of polished walnut, reviewing the dossier his assistant had compiled on Olivia Vasquez. Dr. Olivia Vasquez, 36, never married. BA, MA and PhD from Yale in environmental ethics and philosophy, currently a professor at Columbia University and director of the Hudson Valley Environmental Trust. Author of 2 books on sustainable development and corporate responsibility, both moderately successful in academic circles. Board member of several environmental nonprofits. No significant romantic relationships on record. Accompanying the dossier was a photograph that gave Henry pause. It showed Olivia at some academic conference, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, minimal makeup on her olive-toned face, gesturing emphatically as she made some point to her audience. She wasn't unattractive, Henry had to admit, merely understated. There was intelligence in her brown eyes and a certain intensity in her expression that hinted at passion carefully contained. A fortnight of careful planning later, Henry found himself approaching the modest brownstone in Park Slope, where Olivia lived. He had orchestrated this accidental meeting with military precision, having learned from Brian that Olivia spent every Sunday morning reading in Prospect Park near her home. And there she was, perched on a bench beneath an old oak tree, absorbed in a book, oblivious to the world around her. She wore a simple linen dress, practical flats, and a light cardigan against the September chill. Her hair was gathered in a loose bun, several strands escaping to frame her face. Without the severe academic setting, she looked younger, softer somehow. Henry adjusted his casual designer sweater and jeans, a calculated departure from his usual bespoke suits, and approached. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, injecting just the right note of surprise into his voice. "What a pleasant coincidence." Olivia looked up, momentary confusion crossing her features before recognition dawned. Her expression immediately cooled. "Mr. Blackwood, I doubt anything about this encounter is coincidental." Her directness caught him off guard, but Henry recovered quickly, offering his most disarming smile. "You caught me. Brian mentioned you might be here." A partial truth was always more convincing than a complete fabrication. "Did he also mention our conversation about your ridiculous proposition?" She closed her book, keeping her finger between the pages to mark her place. "He did." Henry gestured to the space beside her. "May I?" Olivia sighed but shifted slightly to make room. I suppose we should discuss this absurdity directly. Henry sat, careful to maintain a respectful distance. I appreciate your pragmatism. Let's be clear, Olivia said, meeting his gaze directly. I find this entire concept morally repugnant. The idea of marriage as a business transaction, or worse, as a game, goes against everything I believe. Yet, here we are, Henry observed. Yes, Olivia acknowledged, because $1 million would allow the trust to purchase and preserve the riverside wetlands, which your colleague, Senator Thompson, is currently eyeing for his next golf resort. Henry allowed himself a smile. Self-interest masked as principle. This he understood. So we both have something to gain. And something to lose, Olivia countered. 6 months of my life pretending to be enamored with a man who represents everything I oppose professionally. Perhaps you'll find I'm not the villain you imagine, Henry suggested, leaning slightly closer. Olivia's eyebrow arched skeptically. Your reputation suggests otherwise, Mr. Blackwood. Henry, please, he corrected softly. If we're to be married, even temporarily, we should at least be on first-name terms. Olivia studied him for a long moment, her brown eyes analytical, as if he were a specimen under her microscope. I have conditions, she finally said. My conditions are non-negotiable, Olivia continued, her posture straightening as she shifted into what Henry recognized as her professional demeanor. First, we maintain entirely separate lives when not in public. I keep my apartment, you keep yours. Unacceptable, Henry countered smoothly. Marriage, even one of convenience, requires cohabitation to be convincing. I have a 3-bedroom penthouse on 5th Avenue. You would have your own room, your own bathroom, complete privacy when desired. Olivia frowned. Your penthouse is a monument to excess. I couldn't possibly. Then my estate in the Berkshires, Henry interrupted. Farmhouse style, organic gardens, solar panels installed last year. Impeccable environmental credentials. We could commute to the city as needed. A flicker of surprise crossed Olivia's face. You have solar panels on a country estate? Among other sustainable features, Henry confirmed, suppressing a smile at having found a potential crack in her armor. The property has been carbon neutral for 2 years now. Olivia's eyes narrowed suspiciously. A token gesture for appearance's sake. A sound business decision, Henry corrected. Sustainability sells to the luxury market. Being environmentally conscious doesn't always mean being unprofitable, Dr. Vasquez. She considered this for a moment. I'll need to see these modifications myself. Of course, Henry agreed readily. We can visit this weekend. That brings me to my second condition, Olivia continued. No physical intimacy whatsoever. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. Henry leaned back, studying her with a slight smirk. Not even for appearances? People will find it odd if I never so much as hold my wife's hand. Olivia's cheeks colored slightly. Minimal contact in public only. Hand-holding occasionally, a brief kiss at the wedding, perhaps a hand at the small of my back when appropriate. Nothing more. Agreed, Henry said, perhaps too quickly. Third condition. I maintain complete autonomy in my professional life. You will not interfere with my work, my activism, or my research. I will not be trotted out as the environmentalist wife to greenwash your corporate image. Provided you extend me the same courtesy, Henry countered. No using our marriage to gain insider information or to undermine my business ventures. Olivia's jaw tightened. I would never. You're already involved with the group opposing my Brooklyn development, Henry reminded her. A development, I might add, that includes affordable housing units and public green spaces. Along with luxury condos priced so high they'll accelerate gentrification and push out local residents, Olivia shot back. Not to mention demolishing a building with significant historical value. Henry felt a flash of genuine irritation. That historical factory was a sweatshop where children as young as 6 worked 16-hour days in the early 1900s. Hardly a heritage worth preserving. The building represents an important period in Brooklyn's industrial history, Olivia insisted. It could be repurposed rather than demolished. At 3 times the cost, making the entire project financially unviable. Henry shook his head. This is precisely what I mean. We'll need a professional detente for this arrangement to work. Olivia took a deep breath, visibly collecting herself. Fine. A mutual non-interference pact regarding our professional activities. but I reserve the right to continue my advocacy work in general terms. As do I my business ventures, Henry agreed. Anything else? Yes. The wedding must be small, private, and without ostentation. I won't participate in some vulgar display of wealth. Henry considered protesting. His social standing demanded a certain level of ceremony, but recognized a battle not worth fighting. Agreed. A civil ceremony with close friends and family only. And finally, Olivia said, her voice softening slightly, when this is over, we part ways cleanly. No public drama, no attempts to extend the arrangement beyond our agreed-upon 6 months. Unless, of course, you fall madly in love with me, Henry couldn't resist adding with a roguish smile. Olivia's expression remained impassive. I think we both know that's not going to happen, Mr. Blackwood. Henry, he corrected again, extending his hand. Do we have a deal, Olivia? She hesitated only briefly before taking his hand. Her grip was firmer than he expected, her skin cool against his palm. We have a deal. God help us both. As their hands separated, a peculiar sensation lingered on Henry's skin. He had sealed countless business deals before, but none had left him feeling quite so unsettled. The marriage of Henry Blackwood and Dr. Olivia Vasquez took place 3 weeks later at the Manhattan City Clerk's office, with only Brian, Henry's assistant Jane, and Olivia's closest friend from graduate school, Dr. Charlotte Wright, in attendance. Olivia wore a simple ivory dress that Henry suspected had been in her wardrobe already, while he conceded to her wishes by wearing a comparatively subdued grey suit rather than his preferred bespoke tailoring. The officiant, a plump woman with kind eyes, clearly found their obvious mismatch curious, but conducted the ceremony with professional discretion. When the moment came for Henry to kiss his bride, he placed a hand gently at Olivia's waist and pressed his lips briefly to hers. It was a chaste kiss by any standard, yet he felt her stiffen beneath his touch, and when he pulled away, her eyes remained closed for just a fraction longer than necessary. There was no reception, merely a brief luncheon at a discreet Michelin-starred restaurant in Tribeca, where Henry had reserved a private dining room. The conversation flowed more easily than he had anticipated, with Charlotte proving unexpectedly amusing, and Brian on his most charming behavior. To new beginnings, Brian toasted, raising his champagne flute with a barely concealed smirk that Henry found increasingly irritating. And to unexpected partnerships, Charlotte added, her intelligent eyes moving between Henry and Olivia with undisguised curiosity. By mid-afternoon, the small party disbanded. Brian and Charlotte departed with promises to visit the couple at the Berkshires estate the following weekend, leaving the newlyweds to begin their peculiar arrangement. I've had your things moved to Oakwood Manor, Henry informed Olivia as they stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant. My driver can take us there now or tomorrow if you prefer. Oakwood, Olivia raised an eyebrow. Sounds pretentious. Please tell me you didn't name it yourself. A smile tugged at Henry's lips. I didn't, in fact. The previous owners named it after the ancient oak trees on the property, though I kept it because it has a certain ring to it. And you didn't change it? I saw no reason to. It's a perfectly good name with historic resonance. He paused, studying her. Does it bother you? Olivia shook her head slightly. No, it's just unexpectedly traditional for a man of your practical disposition. I contain multitudes, Henry replied lightly. Shall we go today? The fall colors in the Berkshires are particularly beautiful right now. Olivia hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I think I'd like to get settled. She glanced down at her simple wedding band, a plain platinum circle that matched the one now adorning Henry's left hand. And I should see these environmental modifications you're so proud of. The drive to Western Massachusetts took just under 3 hours, during which Olivia alternated between gazing out the window at the passing countryside and reading from a slim volume of poetry she had produced from her handbag. Henry used the time to review business documents on his tablet, occasionally stealing glances at his new wife. Wife. The word felt foreign in his mind. He had never seriously considered marriage before, viewing it as an unnecessary complication in his carefully ordered life. Now he found himself legally bound to perhaps the one woman in New York who found him completely resistible. The irony was not lost on him. As the car turned onto a tree-lined private lane, Olivia finally set aside her book. How long have you owned this property? 5 years, Henry replied, closing his tablet. It was in considerable disrepair when I purchased it. The restoration took nearly 2 years. The car rounded a gentle curve, and Oakwood Manor came into view. Built of weathered grey stone and warm cedar, the country house sprawled elegantly across its hilltop setting, windows gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Formal gardens stretched from the front terrace, gradually giving way to more naturalistic landscaping that blended seamlessly with the surrounding countryside. Henry watched Olivia's face carefully, pleased when her eyes widened appreciatively. "It's beautiful," she admitted. "Much more harmonious with the landscape than I expected." "Did you anticipate some modernist glass monstrosity?" he asked, amused. "Something like that," Olivia confessed. "Or perhaps an aggressive statement of wealth and power, like your Manhattan Tower." "Different contexts demand different approaches," Henry said, as the car pulled up to the front entrance. "In New York, my building needs to command attention. Here, the structure should honor the setting." A silver-haired man in a dark jacket appeared at the entrance as they exited the car. "Welcome home, sir. And may I offer my congratulations to you both?" "Thank you, Johnson," Henry replied. "Dr. Vasquez, this is Johnson, who manages Oakwood and keeps everything running smoothly." "Johnson, my wife, Dr. Olivia Vasquez Blackwood." Olivia shot Henry a sharp look at the hyphenated surname. They had not discussed this detail, but quickly composed her features into a polite smile. "A pleasure to meet you, Johnson. I hope my arrival hasn't caused too much disruption." "Not at all, ma'am. We're delighted to have you here. Mrs. Garcia has prepared tea in the south drawing room, and your rooms have been arranged as Mr. Blackwood specified." As Johnson led them into the house, Olivia whispered to Henry, "Vasquez Blackwood, we didn't agree to that." "For appearances only," Henry murmured back. "You can continue using Vasquez professionally." The interior of Oakwood Manor surprised Olivia once again. Rather than the ostentatious luxury she had expected, the rooms were furnished with an elegant restraint that respected the building's history while incorporating modern comforts. Original architectural features had been meticulously preserved, complemented by a color palette of subtle earth tones and textiles that spoke of quality rather than showiness. After tea, served by the housekeeper Mrs. Garcia, with warm scones and homemade preserves, Henry gave Olivia a tour of the house. Her private suite consisted of a spacious bedroom with a sitting area, a luxurious bathroom, and a small study overlooking the rose garden. "I had bookshelves installed when I heard you were coming," Henry explained, indicating the empty built-in shelving that lined one wall of the study. "Your academic books have been unpacked in your office at the university, but I thought you might want to bring some of your personal collection here." Olivia ran her fingers along the shelves, momentarily speechless. "That was thoughtful of you." "I can be on occasion," Henry replied, with a hint of dryness. "Now, would you like to see those environmental features you were so skeptical about?" For the next hour, Henry guided Olivia through the property's sustainability systems, the ground source heat pump that provided heating and cooling, the state-of-the-art solar array discreetly positioned on a south-facing slope away from the main house, the rainwater harvesting system that supplied the gardens and toilets, and the organic kitchen gardens that produced much of the household's produce. To his satisfaction, Olivia's initial skepticism gradually gave way to genuine interest, and even perhaps a reluctant respect. "Why did you do all this?" she finally asked, as they stood on a hillside overlooking the property. "And please don't say it was purely for the resale value." Henry considered his answer carefully. "Partly business, partly personal. Sustainability features do indeed add value to exclusive properties, but I also..." He paused, uncharacteristically hesitant. "I spend time here when New York becomes too much. I wanted this place to represent the best of what's possible, not just what's profitable." Olivia studied him, her expression thoughtful. "That's the first thing you've said that I can actually relate to." "Don't sound so surprised," Henry said lightly. "We may yet find other points of common ground." "Perhaps," Olivia conceded, "though I doubt they'll be numerous." As they walked back toward the house in the gathering dusk, a comfortable silence fell between them. Henry found himself unexpectedly pleased by Olivia's measured approval of Oakwood. He had built his career on acquiring and transforming properties, yet her opinion of this particular restoration mattered more than it should. The first hint of autumn chill crept into the air as darkness fell, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke from the fireplaces that had been lit in their absence. Lights glowed welcomingly from the windows of Oakwood Manor, and for a brief moment, Henry could almost imagine this was a genuine homecoming with a genuine wife, rather than the opening move in an elaborate game. "Dinner will be served in an hour," he informed Olivia as they stepped into the warmth of the entrance hall. "Unless you're too tired." "No, dinner would be nice," she replied, removing her light jacket. "But I'd like to rest a bit first, if you don't mind." "Of course, Johnson will show you back to your rooms." Henry hesitated, then added, "Welcome to Oakwood, Olivia." Her eyes met his, guarded but not hostile. "Thank you, Henry." It was a small victory, hearing his name on her lips without the usual edge of disdain. As Henry watched her follow Johnson up the grand staircase, he felt a flicker of something unexpected, not the triumph he had anticipated at the start of his conquest, but rather a strange sense of anticipation, as if the game itself might prove more interesting than he had imagined. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Henry found himself in the unusual position of being thoroughly ignored by a woman living under his roof. Olivia had settled into a routine that seemed specifically designed to minimize their interactions. She rose early, took breakfast in her rooms, and was often gone before Henry came downstairs. On weekdays, she commuted to New York for her university duties, returning late in the evening. Weekends found her either locked away in her study working on research papers or walking the extensive grounds, a notebook in hand, cataloging the local flora and fauna with scientific precision. When circumstances did force them to share space, primarily dinners when both were at Oakwood, Olivia was unfailingly polite but distant, limiting conversation to practical matters or responding to Henry's attempts at engagement with the briefest possible answers. It was, Henry reflected ruefully, as he sat alone at the breakfast table one Sunday morning, rather like living with an exceptionally well-mannered ghost. "Will Dr. Vasquez Blackwood be joining you this morning, sir?" Johnson inquired as he refreshed Henry's coffee. "I rather doubt it," Henry replied dryly. "She appears to be maintaining her usual strategic absence." Johnson's face remained professionally impassive, but Henry detected a hint of sympathy in the old man's eyes. "Perhaps sir might be interested to know that the doctor often takes her morning tea in the East Garden when the weather permits. She seems particularly fond of the bench by the old maple tree." Henry raised an eyebrow at this unexpected alliance. "Thank you, Johnson. I believe I might take a walk in that direction shortly." "Very good, sir." Johnson gave a small nod that might almost have been approval before discreetly withdrawing. Half an hour later, Henry followed the flagstone path that wound through the formal gardens and into the more naturalistic eastern section of the grounds. The morning was crisp but fine, autumn sunlight filtering through trees turning brilliant shades of red and gold. He spotted Olivia exactly where Johnson had indicated, seated on a weathered wooden bench beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient maple tree, a steaming mug cupped in her hands. She wore faded jeans, hiking boots, and an oversized cable-knit sweater that should have looked shapeless, but somehow suited her. Her dark hair was loose for once, falling in waves around her shoulders, catching glints of chestnut in the dappled sunlight. With her face relaxed and her guard down, Henry was struck by how much younger she appeared. "Good morning," he called, approaching at a deliberately casual pace. "Mind if I join you?" Olivia looked up, surprise quickly replaced by her usual reserve. "It's your garden." "Our garden, technically," Henry corrected mildly, settling beside her on the bench. "At least for the next 5 months and 1 week." The ghost of a smile flickered across Olivia's face. "You're counting, aren't you?" "Touché." She took a sip from her mug, which Henry now saw contained tea so strong it was nearly black. "Is that tea or motor oil?" he asked, nodding toward her mug. "English breakfast, extra strong," Olivia replied. "A habit picked up from my doctoral advisor. He believed weak tea led to weak arguments." "And did it?" "In his case, certainly. The man was addicted to herbal teas and could never defend his positions on Kantian ethics with any vigor." This time her smile lingered, and Henry found himself unreasonably pleased at having provoked it. "I never developed a taste for tea," Henry admitted. "Coffee is more my speed." Olivia nodded toward his monogrammed mug. "Let me guess, single origin, freshly ground, precisely measured, and brewed at the optimal temperature." "When possible," Henry acknowledged, "though I'm not above drinking airport coffee in desperate times." "How plebeian of you." Olivia remarked, but there was no real bite to her tone. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment, watching a pair of cardinals hopping about on the lawn. Henry was reluctant to disrupt this rare moment of peace between them, but aware that opportunities for genuine conversation with Olivia were scarce. "We've been married for nearly a month," he observed. "Yet I feel I know less about you than I do about my newest executive assistant." Olivia slanted a glance at him. "That's rather the point of our arrangement, isn't it? To maintain our separate lives." "In private, yes," Henry conceded. "But if this charade is to be convincing, we should at least be able to answer basic questions about each other. Favorite foods, childhood pets, embarrassing college stories, the sort of things spouses typically know." Olivia considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "I suppose that's reasonable. What would you like to know?" What followed was a peculiar exchange, a getting-to-know-you conversation between two people already legally married. Henry learned that Olivia had been a precocious child who read encyclopedias for fun, had a tortoise named Darwin throughout her childhood, suffered from severe motion sickness, and possessed a surprising talent for the piano, which she rarely indulged these days. In return, he found himself sharing details he rarely discussed. His working-class childhood in the Bronx before a scholarship to Phillips Exeter Academy changed his trajectory, his brief and disastrous attempt at college football, his secret fondness for sci-fi novels. "Science fiction," Olivia repeated, clearly amused. "I wouldn't have guessed that. I had you pegged for biographies of ruthless business tycoons." "I read those too," Henry admitted with a chuckle. "But sometimes one needs to escape to worlds where problems can be solved with faster-than-light travel and conveniently advanced technology, rather than complex human emotions and societal structures." "Precisely." Henry found himself studying the way sunlight brought out amber highlights in her brown eyes. "Relationships are considerably messier than warp drives and alien civilizations." Something in his tone caused Olivia to look away, the moment of easy camaraderie evaporating. "Speaking of relationships," she said, rising from the bench, "we should discuss our first public appearance as a couple. Brian has been asking when we'll make our debut at a suitable social function." Henry felt a twinge of regret at the shift back to business. "There's a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art next Saturday. Many of my business associates will be there, as well as several members of your academic circle. It would be an appropriate venue." "Very well," Olivia nodded briskly. "I assume formal attire is required." "Black tie," Henry confirmed. "Do you need to shop for a gown? I can arrange." "I have suitable clothing," Olivia cut him off. "Contrary to your apparent assumption, academics occasionally attend formal events." Henry raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I meant no offense. I only wanted to offer resources if needed." Olivia's posture softened slightly. "I apologize for snapping. This situation is challenging. For us both," Henry acknowledged, rising to stand beside her. "But we've managed civil conversation for nearly an hour without either of us drawing blood. Progress, wouldn't you say?" That earned him another fleeting smile. "A diplomatic breakthrough of historical proportions." "Indeed," Henry agreed. "Now, since we're both actually at Oakwood simultaneously and conscious, would you consider joining me for lunch, Mrs. Garcia mentioned something about a roast chicken that sounded promising." Olivia hesitated, then nodded. "That would be acceptable. I need to review some student papers this afternoon, but lunch first would be nice." As they walked back toward the house, Henry carefully maintained a respectful distance, while reflecting that this brief, ordinary conversation represented his most significant advance yet in Operation Olivia. The fact that he found himself genuinely interested in her responses, rather than simply gathering ammunition for his campaign, was a complication he chose not to examine too closely. The charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art marked their first public appearance as a married couple, and Henry found himself unexpectedly nervous as he waited for Olivia in the entrance hall of Oakwood. He had chosen his tuxedo with particular care, Italian of course, but understated by his usual standards. The significance of wanting to impress a woman who had made her disdain for his lifestyle abundantly clear was another matter he preferred not to contemplate. When Olivia descended the grand staircase, however, all analytical thought temporarily abandoned him. Her gown was midnight blue, a simple sheath that followed the lines of her body without clinging, the fabric catching the light as she moved. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, revealing the graceful line of her neck and drawing attention to delicate diamond drop earrings that Henry recognized with surprise as heirloom pieces from his family vault, which he had instructed Johnson to make available to her. "You look—" Words failed him momentarily, an unprecedented occurrence in his experience. "Presentable?" Olivia suggested, reaching the bottom of the stairs. "Breathtaking," Henry corrected, his voice low and sincere. A flush of color touched Olivia's cheeks. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself," she gestured to the earrings. "Johnson insisted these would complement the dress. I hope it's all right that I borrowed them." "They were my grandmother's," Henry said. "They suit you perfectly." An awkward silence fell between them, charged with an undercurrent that Henry couldn't quite identify. Olivia broke it by reaching for her wrap, a simple cashmere stole in the same deep blue as her dress. "Shall we go? I believe we have a marriage to perform." The drive to New York passed in relative silence, both seemingly preoccupied with the evening ahead. Henry used the time to mentally prepare for the complex social dynamics they would face. His unexpected marriage had been the subject of intense speculation in business and social circles, with theories ranging from the romantic to the mercenary. Tonight would establish the public narrative of their relationship, and despite their private arrangement, it was essential that they present as a genuine couple. As they pulled up to the museum's grand entrance, Henry turned to Olivia. "Ready?" She took a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." Henry stepped out first, then extended his hand to assist Olivia from the car. As she emerged, he placed his hand lightly at the small of her back, the first time he had touched her since their wedding day, and felt her momentary tension before she relaxed into the practiced pose of a society wife. The gala was in full swing, the museum's magnificent sculpture gallery transformed by strategic lighting and floral arrangements into a glittering reception space. As they entered, Henry was acutely aware of the ripple of interest that spread through the assembled guests. Heads turned, conversations paused, and within moments, the first of what would doubtless be many curious well-wishers approached. "Henry, darling!" Victoria Winthrop, a formidable septuagenarian whose family had been involved in New York real estate since the Gilded Age, descended upon them with regal determination. "You naughty man, getting married without telling any of us." And to such a distinguished academic, no less. Henry summoned his most charming smile. "Victoria, may I present my wife, Dr. Olivia Vasquez Blackwood." "Olivia, Victoria is one of New York's great patrons of the arts and an old family friend. How do you do?" Olivia extended her hand with perfect composure. "I believe we met briefly at a Natural History Museum fundraiser last year, though I was Dr. Vasquez then." "Indeed we did," Victoria confirmed, clearly impressed by Olivia's recall. "You gave that fascinating talk on the ethical considerations of displaying cultural artifacts from former colonies. Quite provocative." "She continues to be so," Henry remarked, allowing genuine affection to color his tone as he glanced at his wife. "Life is never dull with Olivia." "I should think not," Victoria agreed. "Now, you simply must tell me how you two met. The speculation has been running wild." Henry opened his mouth to deliver their rehearsed story, a chance meeting at a university lecture he had attended on sustainable urban development. But Olivia spoke first. "Henry made a bet with my brother," she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of those nearby. "He wagered that he could make me fall in love with him within 6 months." A shocked silence fell over their immediate vicinity. Henry felt a cold spike of alarm, followed quickly by the realization that Olivia was smiling up at him with what appeared to be genuine amusement. "Darling," she continued, placing a hand on his arm, "do tell Victoria how spectacularly your plan backfired when you found yourself falling for me first." Relief and admiration flooded through Henry in equal measure. The truth, artfully reframed as a romantic comedy rather than a mercenary arrangement, was brilliant in its simplicity. No complicated lies to maintain, and far more interesting than their bland cover story. "What can I say?" Henry played along seamlessly, covering Olivia's hand with his own. "I thought I was the hunter, only to discover I was the prey. By the time I realized what had happened, it was too late to save myself." Victoria let out a delighted laugh. "How perfectly marvelous, a modern Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet." Pride brought low by unexpected affection. Something like that, Olivia agreed, her eyes meeting Henry's with an unspoken challenge. As Victoria drifted away to spread this delicious new narrative, Henry leaned down to murmur in Olivia's ear, "That was unexpectedly brilliant and dangerous." "The most convincing lies contain elements of truth," Olivia replied softly. "Besides, it's much more entertaining than our boring lecture story." "Careful, Doctor Vasquez," Henry warned, a smile playing at his lips. "One might almost think you're enjoying this charade." "Merely making the best of an awkward situation," Olivia countered, but the sparkle in her eyes suggested she was not entirely immune to the excitement of their shared performance. The remainder of the evening unfolded with surprising ease. They circulated among the guests, Olivia handling Henry's business associates with gracious intelligence, while he charmed her academic colleagues with genuine interest in their work. They danced once, a slow waltz, during which Henry was acutely conscious of Olivia's hand in his, the subtle scent of her perfume, and the careful space she maintained between their bodies even as they moved in perfect synchrony. By any objective measure, their debut as a couple was an unqualified success. Yet as they returned to Oakwood in the early hours of the morning, Henry found himself troubled by a nagging sense of dissatisfaction. Their performance had been flawless, perhaps too flawless. The ease with which they had presented themselves as a besotted couple made their actual relationship, with its careful distance and diplomatic negotiations, seem all the more artificial. Olivia yawned delicately as they entered the house, removing her wrap in the dimly lit entrance hall. "Well, I believe we've successfully convinced New York society of our mutual infatuation. Mission accomplished." "Indeed," Henry agreed, loosening his bow tie. "You were remarkably convincing. Have you considered a career in theater?" "I teach undergraduates," Olivia replied dryly. "It's essentially the same skill set." Henry chuckled, then on impulse reached out to touch the diamond earring glinting at her earlobe. "These really do suit you. Consider them yours." Olivia stepped back, her expression suddenly guarded. "That's not necessary. This isn't Pretty Woman, Henry. You don't need to ply me with jewelry." "That wasn't my intention," Henry protested, stung by the comparison. "It was a genuine gesture." "Well, it's an unnecessary one," Olivia said firmly. "I'll return them to Johnson in the morning." "As you wish." Henry's voice cooled to match hers. "Good night, Olivia." "Good night." She turned toward the stairs, then paused. "Thank you for this evening. Despite everything, it wasn't entirely unpleasant." Before Henry could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone in the hall with the distinct feeling that for every step forward in their peculiar relationship, they inevitably took 2 steps back. The following morning, Henry woke to news that would complicate matters considerably. His phone buzzed with an urgent message from his New York office. The Blackwood Group's quarterly financial reports showed an unexpected downturn in several key projects, with the Brooklyn development performing particularly poorly. Further investigation had revealed an organized campaign against the project, with potential investors being systematically approached by environmental and community activists armed with detailed objections and alternative proposals. Henry scrolled through the attached documents with growing dismay, which turned to icy anger when he reached the final page. A photograph from a community meeting in Brooklyn, showing a familiar figure addressing the assembled crowd, Olivia, his wife of 1 month, apparently leading the very opposition that threatened his project. Setting his phone down with deliberate care, Henry considered his options. Confrontation was his natural instinct, but he reminded himself of their agreement: mutual non-interference in professional matters. Still, actively undermining a major Blackwood Group project seemed to cross a line from professional autonomy into direct sabotage. As he dressed for the day, Henry's initial fury gradually cooled into strategic determination. Olivia had clearly underestimated him if she thought he would simply accept this challenge without response. Perhaps it was time to remind his academic bride that she had married not just any businessman, but one who had built an empire by identifying weaknesses and turning them to his advantage. "Game on, Dr. Vasquez," he thought as he descended the stairs. Game very much on. Henry's opportunity to confront Olivia came sooner than expected. That very evening, she returned to Oakwood earlier than usual, looking tired but satisfied in a way that only increased Henry's irritation. She found him in the library, ostensibly reviewing documents but actually waiting for her return. "You're home early," Henry observed, setting aside his tablet as she entered. Olivia paused in the doorway, clearly surprised to find him there. "I had a productive day. My last class was cancelled, so I decided to avoid rush hour traffic." "Productive indeed," Henry replied, his tone carefully neutral as he reached for the folder beside him. "I understand congratulations are in order." Olivia's wariness was immediate. "What do you mean?" Henry extracted the photograph of her addressing the Brooklyn community meeting and placed it on the coffee table between them. "Your campaign against my waterfront project appears to be gaining traction. Our investor confidence is down 15% this quarter." Olivia's chin lifted slightly, but to her credit, she didn't feign ignorance or offer denials. "The community has legitimate concerns about that development. Concerns you've been actively encouraging," Henry noted, "despite our agreement about professional non-interference." "I haven't interfered with your business," Olivia countered, moving into the room and taking a seat across from him. "I've been working with that community coalition since well before our arrangement. Continuing my existing advocacy work was explicitly permitted in our agreement." "There's a difference between continuing existing work and escalating it," Henry pointed out. "The timing of this intensified opposition campaign seems remarkably coincidental." Olivia's eyes flashed. "You think I married you to sabotage your projects from the inside? That's absurd. I don't need insider information to know that your development will displace hundreds of working-class residents and destroy a historic neighborhood. My development will revitalize a neglected area, create jobs, and include affordable housing units," Henry countered, his voice rising despite his intention to remain calm. "Not that you bothered to ask about those details before rallying opposition. 30 affordable units out of 300 isn't revitalization, it's tokenism," Olivia shot back. "And your definition of affordable still prices out most of the current residents." They glared at each other across the coffee table, the tension between them palpable. Henry was the first to break the silence, leaning back with deliberate casualness. "We seem to have reached an impasse. You believe you're saving a community. I believe I'm improving one. The difference is that I've actually talked to the people who live there," Olivia said, her voice quieter but no less intense. "Have you?" The question caught Henry off guard. "I've reviewed demographic studies and consulted with community representatives." "Hand-picked representatives, I'm sure," Olivia replied with a dismissive wave. "When was the last time you actually walked those streets, spoke with the shopkeepers or the families who've lived there for generations?" "That's what I employ community liaison officers for," Henry countered, though a faint sense of discomfort pricked at him. "I can't personally inspect every property or meet every stakeholder." "No, but you could try meeting some of them before deciding their homes would be better off as luxury condos," Olivia said. Henry studied her for a long moment. She was passionate, he'd grant her that, and there was a conviction in her arguments that went beyond academic theory. A new approach occurred to him, one that might simultaneously address the Brooklyn situation and advance his campaign to win Olivia over. "All right," he said finally, "let's make a deal." Olivia's expression turned suspicious. "Another one?" "A modification to our existing arrangement," Henry clarified. "I'll visit the Brooklyn site with you. Meet some of these residents you're so concerned about, hear their perspective. In return, you'll attend the presentation of our full development plan and actually listen, to what we're proposing." "And then what?" Olivia asked. "And then we each reconsider our positions," Henry said. "I can't promise to abandon the project, but I'm willing to consider adjustments if there are legitimate concerns I've overlooked. Are you equally willing to acknowledge potential benefits if they exist?" Olivia hesitated, clearly weighing the proposal. "That seems reasonable," she finally conceded, "though I doubt it will change my fundamental opposition." "I'm not asking for conversion, just consideration," Henry replied. "Tomorrow? I have classes until 3. I'll pick you up at Columbia at 3:30, Henry said, rising to his feet. "We can go straight to Brooklyn from there." Olivia nodded, standing as well. "Fine, but no suits. You'll stand out like a sore thumb." "I do own casual clothes," Henry protested mildly. $1,000 designer jeans don't count as casual in Gowanus, Olivia informed him with the ghost of a smile. "Try something that doesn't scream corporate raider." "I'll do my best to appear suitably proletarian," Henry promised dryly. As Olivia turned to leave, Henry called after her. "One more thing." She paused. looking back at him with a raised eyebrow. "This professional disagreement," he said carefully. "We should keep it separate from our personal arrangement. I'd rather not spend the next 5 months in constant warfare under this roof." Something like relief flickered across Olivia's face. "Agreed. Oakwood remains neutral territory." "Thank you," Henry said simply. After she left, Henry remained in the library, contemplating this new development. The confrontation had not gone entirely as planned. He had expected denial, perhaps defensiveness, but not Olivia's straightforward challenge. Most surprising was his own response. Rather than shutting down her opposition, as he would with any business adversary, he had proposed a compromise. Was it merely a tactical maneuver, designed to gain her trust and thereby advance his ultimate goal? Or was there something about Olivia's passionate conviction that had genuinely made him pause? Henry preferred not to examine his motivations too closely. Whatever the reason, tomorrow's excursion would certainly advance their relationship beyond its current uneasy détente, one way or another. The following afternoon found Henry dressed in his most understated casual wear, jeans that had actually seen some wear, work boots he kept for occasional visits to construction sites, and a plain Henley under a leather jacket that was perhaps still too expensive, but at least lacked designer logos. He waited in his Range Rover outside Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, feeling oddly like a father picking up his daughter from college rather than a husband collecting his wife. Olivia emerged from the building deep in conversation with a lanky young man who was gazing at her with evident admiration. Henry watched as she laughed at something the student said, her face animated in a way he rarely witnessed at Oakwood. She looked younger, more relaxed, her usual defensive posture replaced by easy authority. When she spotted the Range Rover, Olivia said goodbye to the student and walked over, her professional attire, a tailored blazer over a simple blouse and pencil skirt, contrasting with Henry's casual look. "Sorry, office hours ran late," she said as she climbed in. "You actually managed to look almost normal. I'm impressed." "I aim to please," Henry replied, pulling into the Manhattan traffic. "Do you need to change before we go to Brooklyn?" Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sweater. "I'll just switch this for the blazer. The rest is fine." They drove in relative silence, crossing the Brooklyn Bridge as the afternoon sun gilded the Manhattan skyline behind them. Henry glanced occasionally at Olivia, who seemed lost in thought as she gazed out at the East River. "You seem to enjoy talking with that student," Henry observed. Olivia turned to him with mild surprise. "Theo, he's one of my graduate students, brilliant kid, passionate about environmental justice in urban planning." "You like teaching," Henry said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Olivia confirmed. "It's not just about imparting knowledge, it's seeing young minds develop critical thinking skills, watching them challenge their own assumptions." She paused. "You'd be a good teacher, actually." Now it was Henry's turn to look surprised. "What makes you say that?" "You're articulate, confident, and from what I've seen with your staff, capable of explaining complex concepts clearly," Olivia said matter-of-factly. "Plus, you have the kind of real-world experience that students value." "I've given guest lectures at business schools occasionally," Henry admitted. "It's satisfying in a different way from closing a deal." "Different metrics of success," Olivia nodded. "Money versus impact." "The two aren't mutually exclusive," Henry pointed out as he navigated through the Brooklyn streets toward their destination. "No, but they often pull in different directions," Olivia replied. "We're here. Take that right and try to find parking on Bond Street if you can." The Gowanus neighborhood represented a typical Brooklyn mix of industrial history and gentrification in progress. Weathered brick buildings that had once housed manufacturing now contained artisanal workshops and tech startups, while traditional row houses stood alongside newer, sleeker constructions. Henry's proposed development site occupied several blocks of primarily older industrial and residential buildings at the edge of the rapidly changing district. As they walked the streets, Olivia seemed to know everyone. She introduced Henry simply as "Henry, my husband," without elaborating on his connection to the development, and to his surprise, she didn't use the occasion to ambush him with hostile residents. Instead, she guided him through a genuine tour of the neighborhood, the family-owned hardware store that had operated for 3 generations, the community garden created on a former vacant lot, the senior center where elderly residents gathered for meals and companionship. At a small Puerto Rican restaurant, The owner greeted Olivia with a warm hug before ushering them to a corner table. "You must try the mofongo," Olivia told Henry. "Eleanor makes the best in Brooklyn." "You come here often?" Henry asked after they'd ordered. "At least twice a month," Olivia nodded. "I've been working with the Community Coalition for nearly 2 years. You get to know people." Their food arrived, rich garlicky mofongo for Henry and pescado con coco for Olivia, and Elena refused to take Henry's credit card. "Friends of Olivia eat for half price first time," she insisted. "Next time you pay full." "The assumption being there will be a next time," Henry observed after Elena had moved away. "There should be," Olivia said seriously. "This is the reality of the neighborhood you're planning to transform. Not just buildings and property values, but people with histories, connections, livelihoods." Henry looked around the small restaurant, noting the photographs of family members on the walls, the mix of customers from elderly locals to young professionals, the easy familiarity between staff and regular patrons. It was a vibrant ecosystem, he had to admit, one that wouldn't be captured in the demographic studies and market analyses that typically informed his development decisions. After dinner, they met with a small group of community organizers at a local coffee shop. Henry listened more than he spoke, absorbing their concerns about displacement, rising rents, and the erosion of neighborhood character. He was surprised by the sophistication of their understanding of development economics and zoning regulations. These weren't naive idealists, but informed advocates with concrete counter-proposals. "We're not opposed to development per se," explained Miguel, a retired urban planning professor who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years. "We understand that cities change, but development should build on a community's strengths, not erase its identity." As they walked back to the car several hours later, Henry found himself processing a complex mix of impressions. The neighborhood had challenges, certainly: aging infrastructure, some vacant properties, signs of economic struggle, but also a resilience and social cohesion that didn't fit neatly into the redevelopment narrative he had constructed. "Penny for your thoughts," Olivia said as they reached the Range Rover. "I'm thinking that you've made your point effectively," Henry admitted. "The community has more vitality than our market studies suggested." Olivia looked pleased but cautious. "Does that change your plans?" "It complicates them," Henry said honestly. "I still believe development would benefit the area, but perhaps our current approach is insufficiently nuanced." "That's more consideration than I expected," Olivia acknowledged as they got into the car. "I'm not the villain you imagine me to be," Henry said, starting the engine. "Contrary to popular belief, I don't twirl my mustache and cackle while evicting widows and orphans." That earned him a genuine laugh. "No mustache twirling? I'm disappointed." The drive back to Oakwood was companionable, their conversation touching on urban planning theories, the challenges of balancing preservation with progress, and even some tentative discussion of potential compromises for the Brooklyn project. It was the longest sustained civil exchange they had managed since their marriage began, and Henry found himself reluctant for it to end. "Your turn tomorrow," Olivia reminded him as they arrived home. "The full presentation of your development plan." 9 a.m. at my downtown office, Henry confirmed. "I'll have my driver pick you up at 8. "I can take the train," Olivia started to protest. "Humor me," Henry said. "It's a husband's prerogative to provide transportation occasionally." Olivia rolled her eyes but didn't argue further. As they entered the house, she surprised him by touching his arm lightly. "Thank you for today. For listening, even if we still disagree." "Thank you for showing me," Henry replied, "even if it made my life more complicated." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Complicating privileged lives is what I do best, Professor Vasquez, at your service." Henry found himself returning her smile. "I'm beginning to understand why your students look at you with that mixture of terror and adoration." "A healthy balance to aspire to," Olivia agreed. "Good night, Henry." "Good night, Olivia." As Henry watched her ascend the stairs, he realized with a start that for the first time since their arrangement began, he was genuinely looking forward to the next day with his wife. Whether this represented progress toward his ultimate goal or a dangerous complication, he wasn't entirely sure, but he was certainly no longer bored. The following morning, Henry woke early and spent more time than usual selecting his suit. Not to impress Olivia, he told himself, but because presentation was important for any business meeting. By the time he arrived at Blackwood Tower, Olivia was already in the conference room. having insisted on coming in early to review the materials independently before the formal presentation. She looked up as he entered, professional in a charcoal pantsuit, but with a colorful scarf that added a touch of individuality. "Your staff has been very accommodating," she observed. "Though I think they're confused about why the boss's wife is demanding access to confidential project files." "Let them wonder," Henry replied, setting his briefcase down. "Have you found anything interesting in your preliminary review?" "Several things," Olivia said, tapping a stack of documents. "Your environmental impact assessment makes some optimistic assumptions about traffic patterns and energy usage, and the community benefit package is robust on paper, but vague on implementation timelines." Henry nodded, unsurprised by her thorough analysis. "We'll address those points in the presentation. The full team will be here in 15 minutes. Coffee? Already have some, thanks." Olivia indicated a mug bearing the Columbia University logo, which she had evidently brought herself rather than using Blackwood corporate drinkware. A small act of independence that Henry found more amusing than annoying. The presentation was comprehensive, delivered by Henry's top development executives with supporting commentary from architects, environmental consultants, and financial analysts. Henry himself remained mostly silent, watching Olivia's reactions as his team outlined the vision for transforming the industrial blocks into a mixed-use development featuring apartments, retail spaces, offices, and public amenities. To her credit, Olivia listened attentively, taking notes and asking precise, knowledgeable questions that occasionally made his executives glance nervously at Henry. She neither dismissed the plan outright nor accepted its claims uncritically, pressing for details on everything from construction materials to rent control provisions for existing residents. "Thank you for the thorough presentation," she said, when it concluded 2 hours later. "I appreciate the opportunity to understand the full scope of the project." After the team filed out, Henry closed the conference room door, leaving them alone. "Well, has your perspective changed at all?" Olivia considered the question seriously. "I see more merit in certain aspects than I initially assumed," she acknowledged. "The brownfield remediation plan is impressive, and the public spaces could be valuable if they're truly accessible." "But," Henry prompted, sensing her reservation, "but the displacement issue remains inadequately addressed," Olivia said firmly. "Your relocation assistance program would help some residents, but leave many others without viable options in the neighborhood, and the preservation of historic structures seems performative rather than substantive." Henry nodded, having anticipated these critiques. "What if we increased the percentage of affordable units from 10 to 25% and expanded the relocation assistance to include rent subsidies for a 5-year transition period?" Olivia's eyes widened slightly. "That would be a significant improvement, but it would also cut deeply into your profit margin." "Yes," Henry agreed, "though we could potentially offset some of that through density bonuses and tax incentives for the affordable housing component." "You've already run the numbers on this alternative, haven't you?" Olivia realized. "I had our financial team prepare several scenarios," Henry admitted. "After yesterday's visit, I wanted to be prepared for this conversation." Olivia studied him with newfound curiosity. "Why? Why would you consider compromising on a project that was already approved and financially optimized?" Henry considered deflecting with a pragmatic answer about community relations or long-term business strategy. Instead, somewhat to his own surprise, he opted for honesty. "Because you made me see the neighborhood differently," he said simply. "And because I've built my career on adapting to new information, not ignoring it." Something shifted in Olivia's expression, a softening perhaps, or at least a re-evaluation. "I didn't expect that answer. I'm occasionally capable of surprising even myself," Henry replied with a wry smile. "Does this mean we might find a middle ground on the Brooklyn project?" "Possibly," Olivia said cautiously. "I'd need to discuss any compromise with the community coalition. They're the ones with the most at stake." "Of course," Henry agreed. "I wouldn't expect anything less." A moment of connection passed between them, not romance, certainly, but perhaps the beginning of mutual respect. It was disrupted by Henry's assistant, knocking to remind him of his next meeting. "Duty calls," he said, gathering his materials. "Will you be returning to Columbia this afternoon?" "No, I have research to do at the library," Olivia replied. "I'll see you at Oakwood this evening." "I'll be there for dinner," Henry confirmed. "Perhaps we can continue this discussion then." "I'd like that," Olivia said, and Henry was surprised to realize she seemed to mean it. As he watched her leave the conference room, Henry reflected that their professional détente might be advancing his personal campaign in ways he hadn't anticipated. Olivia had begun to see him as something more than a heartless developer, and he found himself genuinely interested in finding a solution that would satisfy her concerns while still achieving his business objectives. What he didn't yet realize was that their professional collaboration had opened a door to a more dangerous development. He was starting to care what Olivia Vasquez thought of him, not as a means to winning their wager, but for its own sake. The compromise negotiations for the Brooklyn project continued over the next several weeks, creating an unexpected pattern to Henry and Olivia's marriage. Their professional interactions became a strange sort of courtship, intellectual rather than romantic, yet charged with a growing mutual respect. Evenings at Oakwood found them in the library, spread across the sofa and armchairs with laptops, papers, and occasionally glasses of wine, debating the finer points of urban development ethics and practical implementation. The historic facade preservation requirement is going to add at least 8% to the construction budget, Henry pointed out one evening in mid-November, rubbing his eyes after hours of reviewing modified plans. "But it maintains the visual character of the street," Olivia countered from her position cross-legged on the sofa, her laptop balanced on a cushion. "You can market that as a feature, not just a concession, assuming buyers value historic character enough to pay the premium," Henry said. Olivia looked up, a challenging glint in her eye. "If your marketing team can't sell the cachet of living in an authentically preserved Brooklyn landmark, they should be fired." Henry laughed despite his frustration. "Fair point. Though I'm beginning to think you missed your calling. You'd make a formidable real estate developer." "Blasphemy," Olivia declared with mock horror. "Take it back immediately." Their easy banter was interrupted by Johnson appearing at the library door. "Pardon me, sir, but Ms. Jane Wilcox is on the telephone. She says it's urgent regarding the Manchester acquisition." Henry frowned. Jane rarely called after hours unless something was seriously amiss. "I'll take it in my study." "Excuse me, Olivia." In his study, Henry picked up the secure line. "Jane, what's happened?" "We've hit a major roadblock with Manchester," his assistant reported crisply. "Legal just discovered that the property has a historical connection we missed. It was once the headquarters of Vasquez Publishing in the 1980s and early 90s. Henry froze. "Vasquez? As in—" "Yes, sir. It appears to have been owned by Alberto Vasquez, who I believe was Olivia's father," Henry finished, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. What exactly happened with the property? According to the records, Blackwood Properties acquired the building in 1993 through a subsidiary called Atlantic Holdings. The previous owner, Vasquez Publishing, went bankrupt shortly after the sale. There were some questionable tactics involved." "What kind of tactics?" Henry asked, already dreading the answer. "Atlantic Holdings pressured several key advertisers to pull their business from Vasquez's magazines as part of the acquisition strategy. It was technically legal, but ethically problematic. The subsidiary was dissolved a year later." Henry closed his eyes briefly. This had happened during his father's tenure as CEO, but Blackwood Properties was his responsibility now. "Send me everything you have on this, full documentation, no redactions, even internal memos. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." After ending the call, Henry sat motionless behind his desk. This revelation cast their entire arrangement in a new light. Had Brian known? Was the wager some elaborate scheme for revenge? And Olivia? What would this do to their tentative rapport if she discovered that his family's company had been responsible for her father's business failure? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Henry?" Olivia called. "Johnson's serving dinner in 10 minutes. Is everything all right with your call?" "Fine," Henry replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Just a minor complication with a property acquisition. I'll join you shortly." During dinner, Henry found it difficult to focus on conversation, his mind preoccupied with the Manchester revelation. Olivia noticed his distraction, but seemed to attribute it to business concerns, for which he was grateful. He needed time to investigate fully before deciding how or if to broach the subject with her. The following day, Henry cancelled his meetings and sequestered himself in his Manhattan office, reviewing the files Jane had compiled. The picture that emerged was worse than he had feared. Atlantic Holdings, the Blackwood subsidiary, had systematically undermined Vasquez Publishing through a series of targeted maneuvers, poaching key staff, pressuring distributors, and even purchasing debt from creditors to force unfavorable terms. The ultimate goal had been to acquire the company's prime Manhattan real estate at a fraction of its market value. Most disturbing was a memo from his father to the Atlantic Holdings executives. Vasquez is stubborn, but not stupid. Push harder. Everyone has a breaking point. By early afternoon, Henry had pieced together the whole sordid story. Alberto Vasquez had founded his publishing company in the 1970s, building it from a single literary magazine into a respected independent press with several successful titles focused on multicultural literature. The company had been financially stable until Blackwood's intervention, which had forced it into bankruptcy by 1993. According to a news clipping, Alberto Vasquez had suffered a heart attack shortly after losing his company and had passed away within the year. Olivia would have been around 5 years old when her father died. Henry leaned back in his chair, feeling physically ill. His family's company had not just acquired a building, it had destroyed a man's life's work, using tactics that, while perhaps legally defensible, were morally reprehensible. And now, through some cosmic joke or karmic retribution, he had married that man's daughter in a cynical wager. The irony was almost too perfect to be coincidental. Had Brian engineered this entire situation? Henry pulled up his friend's contact and dialed. "Henry, my man," Brian answered cheerfully. "How's married life treating you?" "Did you know?" Henry asked without preamble. A pause. "Know what?" "About Blackwood's involvement in your father's company failure." The silence that followed was telling. Finally, Brian sighed. "I found out a few years ago when I was researching some family history. Atlantic Holdings wasn't exactly subtle in covering its tracks, and you didn't think this was relevant information before proposing our arrangement." Henry struggled to keep his voice level. "Would it have made a difference?" Brian countered. "You'd still have seen Olivia as a conquest, a means to an end." "That's not the point," Henry snapped. "Does she know?" "No," Brian admitted. "Mom protected her from the worst of it. She knows Dad's business failed and that he died heartbroken, but not the specifics of who was responsible. It wasn't something we discussed around the dinner table." Henry closed his eyes briefly. "So I've been living under the same roof with a woman whose family my father destroyed, and neither of us knew it." "Your father, Henry, not you," Brian pointed out. "You were what, 15 at the time?" "It's still my company," Henry replied. "My name on the building. My responsibility now." "What are you going to do?" Brian asked, his tone shifting from defensive to concerned. "I don't know yet," Henry admitted, "but I can't keep this from her. It would be dishonorable." Brian was quiet for a moment. "You've changed, my friend. The Henry Blackwood I've known for 20 years wouldn't be having this crisis of conscience." "Maybe I have," Henry acknowledged. "Or maybe I'm just tired of games." After ending the call, Henry sat motionless, contemplating his next move. The rational course would be to bury this information. Their arrangement was temporary anyway, and revealing such a painful connection would only create unnecessary drama. But the thought of continuing their growing rapport under such false pretenses felt increasingly intolerable. When had Olivia's good opinion begun to matter to him? Was this merely pride, not wanting to be seen as the villain in her story, or something deeper that he wasn't ready to examine too closely? By evening, Henry had made his decision. He would tell Olivia the truth, accept whatever consequences followed, and attempt to make what amends he could. Not to win their wager, but because it was the right thing to do. He returned to Oakwood late, half hoping Olivia would already be asleep. Instead, he found her in the kitchen, making tea in flannel pajamas and a Columbia sweatshirt, her hair loose around her shoulders. "You missed dinner," she observed, not accusingly, but with a hint of curiosity. "Johnson kept a plate warm for you in the oven." "Thank you, but I'm not hungry," Henry replied, suddenly uncertain how to begin this conversation. Olivia studied him for a moment. "You look terrible. Bad day conquering the financial world?" "You could say that." Henry hesitated, then asked, "Would you mind sitting down? There's something I need to discuss with you." Olivia's expression turned wary, but she nodded and carried her tea to the kitchen island, perching on one of the stools. Should I be concerned? Henry took a deep breath. I discovered something today about our respective families. Something troubling? Carefully, methodically, he laid out what he had learned about Blackwood Properties' role in the downfall of Vasquez Publishing. He explained his father's tactics, the deliberate targeting of her father's business, and the devastating consequences. Throughout his explanation, Olivia sat absolutely still, her face becoming more mask-like with each revelation. The building we're currently redeveloping in Manchester was your father's headquarters, Henry concluded. That's how I stumbled onto this connection. I wanted you to hear it from me. Olivia remained silent for a long moment after he finished, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug, knuckles white. When she finally spoke, her voice was unnaturally calm. Let me see if I understand correctly. Your father systematically destroyed my father's company, his life's work, using unethical business tactics to force him into bankruptcy, all to acquire a piece of real estate cheaply. My father died of a heart attack shortly after, leaving my mother to raise 2 children alone. And now, through some cosmic joke, I find myself married to the son and heir of the man responsible. That's the essence of it, yes, Henry confirmed quietly. Olivia laughed, a harsh sound utterly devoid of humor. And you had no idea about any of this when you agreed to Brian's ridiculous wager? None, Henry said. Though I'm beginning to wonder if Brian did. Of course he did, Olivia snapped, her composure finally cracking. Brian was 12 when it happened. He remembers everything. The creditors calling, the staff being laid off, the day Mom came home and told us Dad wouldn't be coming back. Her voice broke slightly on the last words. Henry resisted the urge to reach for her hand. I'm truly sorry, Olivia. I know that doesn't change anything, but no, it doesn't, she cut him off, sliding off the stool and moving away from him. 25 years of wondering what went wrong, why our family fell apart, and all along it was just another Blackwood acquisition strategy. I was 15 when it happened, Henry said. I had nothing to do with... But you benefited from it, didn't you? Olivia challenged, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Your education, your first ventures, your entire empire, built on profits from deals just like the one that destroyed my family. Henry couldn't deny it. His father's cutthroat business practices had created the foundation for his own success, a fact he had conveniently overlooked throughout his career. You're right, he acknowledged. I can't separate myself from that history, even if I wasn't directly involved. Olivia took a deep, shuddering breath. I need you to leave. Olivia, I mean it, Henry. I need space to process this. I can't look at you right now without seeing your father, your company, everything we lost. Henry nodded slowly. I understand. I'll go back to the city tonight. Thank you, Olivia said stiffly, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't return to Oakwood for a while. I'll stay here and fulfill our public obligations as needed, but I need distance from this. Of course, Henry agreed, feeling a strange hollowness in his chest. For what it's worth, I'm going to look into making amends, not to win you over or satisfy some misplaced guilt, but because it's the right thing to do. Olivia looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, anger mixed with something like disappointment, as if she had begun to expect better from him. Do whatever helps you sleep at night, Henry. It won't change the past. With that, she left the kitchen, her untouched tea still steaming on the counter. Henry remained there for a long while afterward, feeling the weight of a legacy he had never fully examined until now. In the days that followed, Henry immersed himself in researching the Vasquez publishing story. He tracked down former employees, reviewed old contracts and correspondence, and pieced together a comprehensive understanding of what his father's company had destroyed. Alberto Vasquez had been a visionary publisher who championed diverse voices long before diversity became a publishing buzzword. His flagship magazine, Puentes Bridges, had been one of the first mainstream publications dedicated to Latino literature and culture, while his book imprint had launched the careers of several significant authors who struggled to find representation elsewhere. The more Henry learned, the more he understood the magnitude of the loss. Vasquez Publishing hadn't just been a business, it had been a cultural institution with a mission that extended far beyond profit margins. Its destruction had silenced voices and perspectives that the publishing world had sorely needed. Simultaneously, Henry began the process of revising the Brooklyn development plans, incorporating not just the compromises he and Olivia had discussed, but additional community benefits they hadn't yet considered. He worked directly with the neighborhood coalition, listening to their concerns and involving them in the redesign process. The resulting plan was less profitable, but more sustainable, both economically and socially. "You've made significant concessions," his CFO observed during a review meeting. "The board is going to have questions about the reduced profit projections." "Let them question," Henry replied. "I'll defend every modification as a sound long-term investment in community goodwill and sustainable development." Though he was fully engaged in these professional endeavors, Henry found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Olivia. They maintained minimal contact, a few terse text messages regarding social obligations they needed to coordinate, but the absence of their evening debates and slowly warming interactions left a void he hadn't anticipated. After 3 weeks of separation, Henry received an unexpected call from Brian. "Olivia told me what you discovered," his friend said without preamble, "and about your research into our father's publishing house." "You could have told her years ago," Henry pointed out. "Why didn't you?" Brian sighed. "What good would it have done? It would only have given her pain without any possibility of resolution." "She deserved to know the truth," Henry insisted. "And now she does," Brian acknowledged. "But that's not why I'm calling. She mentioned you're looking into ways to make amends. I'm curious what you're planning." Henry hesitated, then decided there was no reason for secrecy. "I'm considering re-establishing Vasquez Publishing, or something very similar. A new imprint focused on the same mission your father had, championing diverse voices and perspectives." Silence greeted this announcement. Finally, Brian spoke, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "Are you doing this to win her back, Henry?" "No," Henry answered honestly. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. Whether Olivia ever forgives me or not, something valuable was lost when your father's company went under. If I have the means to restore some version of it, I should." "You really have changed," Brian observed. "I never expected this wager to transform you rather than her." Henry laughed shortly. "Neither did I." "For what it's worth," Brian added before hanging up, "she misses your debates. She won't admit it, but she does." The following week, Henry took the most significant step in his amends project. He organized a meeting with Charlotte Wright, Olivia's close friend who had attended their wedding. Charlotte had maintained contact with Henry occasionally, checking on him after news of his separation from Olivia began circulating in their social circles. They met at a quiet cafe in Greenwich Village, far from Henry's usual business haunts. Charlotte arrived punctually, regarding him with cautious curiosity as she took a seat across from him. "Thank you for meeting me," Henry began. "I wanted to discuss something important and I thought you might provide some insight." "About Olivia?" Charlotte asked directly. "Indirectly," Henry clarified. "I've been researching her father's publishing company and considering establishing a new imprint with a similar mission. Given your position in the literary world, I thought you might have valuable perspectives on how to approach this meaningfully rather than superficially." Charlotte studied him for a long moment. "This isn't just some elaborate ploy to win her back?" "No," Henry said firmly. "It's about addressing a wrong that my family's company committed, regardless of what happens between Olivia and me." Something in his sincerity must have convinced her, because Charlotte's expression softened. Alberto Vasquez was ahead of his time. The publishing industry still hasn't fully embraced the diversity of voices he championed in the 80s and early 90s. For the next hour, they discussed the potential structure, mission, and focus of a new publishing venture. Charlotte's expertise as a literature professor provided invaluable insights into the current gaps in the industry and how a Vasquez-inspired imprint might address them. As their meeting concluded, Charlotte fixed Henry with a penetrating gaze. "You know this won't automatically fix things with Olivia, right?" "I'm not expecting it to," Henry assured her. "This is about doing what's right, not what's expedient." Charlotte nodded slowly. "I believe you. And for what it's worth, I think this could be a meaningful tribute to Alberto's legacy, if it's done with genuine commitment." "That's my intention," Henry promised. When Charlotte left, Henry remained at the cafe, making notes on their conversation. For the first time in his career, he was pursuing a project with no clear profit motive or strategic advantage. The sensation was both disorienting and oddly liberating. His phone buzzed with a text from Olivia, the first she had initiated since their separation. Need to discuss upcoming Miller Foundation Gala. Media expecting joint appearance. How do you want to handle? Henry considered his response carefully before typing, I'll attend if you're comfortable with that. We can maintain our arrangement for public appearances while respecting your need for space privately. Her response came quickly. Acceptable. 7 p.m. pickup on Saturday. Please coordinate with Johnson regarding attire. Formal and detached, but at least she was willing to continue their public facade. It wasn't much, but it was something. Henry found himself unreasonably heartened by even this minimal contact. The Miller Foundation Gala would be their first public appearance since the revelation about their family's connection. Henry was under no illusions that one evening would repair the damage, but perhaps it would provide an opportunity to demonstrate that his efforts toward redemption were genuine. What he didn't anticipate was that the evening would bring another revelation, one that would force both Henry and Olivia to confront feelings neither was prepared to acknowledge. The Miller Foundation Gala was perhaps the most significant charity event of the New York social season, bringing together politicians, business leaders, and cultural figures in a lavish display of philanthropy. Under normal circumstances, Henry would have approached the evening with practiced ease, navigating the complex social currents with the confidence of someone accustomed to being among the most powerful people in any room. Tonight, however, as his car approached Oakwood to collect Olivia, Henry found himself uncharacteristically nervous. Their text exchanges had been coolly professional, offering no hint of her current state of mind. Would she maintain their marital charade convincingly, or would the strain between them be evident to the observant eyes of New York society? The car pulled up to the entrance, and Henry stepped out rather than sending the driver. Johnson opened the door with his usual impeccable timing. "Good evening, sir," he greeted Henry with formal correctness that nonetheless conveyed a certain approval. "Dr. Vasquez Blackwood will be down momentarily." "Thank you, Johnson," Henry replied, remaining in the entrance hall rather than entering further. He felt strangely like a visitor in what had briefly felt like home. The sound of footsteps on the stairs drew his attention upward. Olivia descended slowly, and Henry felt an involuntary tightening in his chest. She wore a gown of deep emerald that contrasted beautifully with her olive skin, her dark hair swept up in an elegant style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. Most striking was the absence of any jewelry, except for the simple platinum wedding band he had placed on her finger months ago. "You look beautiful," Henry said simply when she reached the bottom of the stairs. "Thank you," Olivia replied, her tone polite but distant. "You look well, the city agrees with you." An awkward silence fell between them until Johnson appeared with Olivia's wrap, a black cashmere stole that he draped carefully around her shoulders. "The car is waiting," Henry said unnecessarily. The drive to Manhattan passed mostly in silence. Henry made a few attempts at neutral conversation, updates on the Brooklyn project's community-focused redesign, the unusually mild December weather, which Olivia acknowledged with brief responses. The tension was palpable, yet beneath it ran an undercurrent of something else, something neither of them seemed willing to address directly. As they neared the venue, Olivia finally turned to him. "How do you want to play this evening?" "However you're comfortable," Henry replied. Though given the media presence, some degree of united front would be advisable. "Agreed," Olivia nodded. "Cordial spouses it is, then." "Olivia," Henry began, feeling a sudden need to clear the air before they stepped into the public eye. "I want you to know—" "Not now, Henry," she interrupted gently. "Tonight isn't about us. Let's just get through this evening with our dignity intact, shall we?" Henry nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her approach. "As you wish." The Miller Foundation had transformed the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel into a winter wonderland, with crystalline decorations and subtle lighting creating an atmosphere of ethereal elegance. As Henry and Olivia entered, her hand resting lightly on his arm, the inevitable ripple of interest passed through the assembled guests. Their unexpected marriage had been the subject of considerable speculation in social circles, and their recent separate appearances had fueled rumors of trouble in paradise. Henry and Olivia Blackwood, Thomas Miller himself approached to greet them, his wife Catherine at his side. "We are delighted you could both attend. There's been some concern you might have scheduling conflicts." "We wouldn't miss your remarkable event, Tom," Henry replied smoothly. The Foundation's work in educational access is too important. Indeed it is, Olivia agreed warmly. Your scholarship program for underprivileged students is making a genuine difference in many lives. Catherine Miller beamed. Dr. Vasquez, your insights were invaluable when we restructured the selection process last year. The diversity of our scholarship recipients has improved dramatically. As the conversation continued, Henry observed Olivia with growing admiration. Despite her personal turmoil, she engaged with the Millers on a substantive level, demonstrating genuine knowledge of and commitment to their philanthropic work. There was nothing performative about her interest. This was who she truly was. Their conversation with the Millers eventually concluded, and they moved further into the ballroom, navigating the complex social dynamics with practiced ease. To outside observers, they appeared the perfect power couple. He the successful businessman with unexpectedly progressive leanings, she the principled academic who had supposedly humanized him. The irony of this public perception was not lost on either of them. As the evening progressed, they found themselves in conversation with Senator James Thompson, a powerful figure known for his pro-development policies. Blackwood, the senator greeted Henry with a firm handshake. Good to see you. I understand your Brooklyn project is undergoing some significant revisions. Neighborhood pressure getting to you. His tone suggested he considered such concessions a weakness. Before Henry could respond, Olivia interjected smoothly. Actually, Senator, the revisions reflect an innovative approach to sustainable urban development. Henry recognized that community integration creates long-term value that far outweighs short-term profit maximization. Henry glanced at her in surprise before adding, exactly so. The revised plan includes historical preservation elements and affordable housing components that will actually enhance the project's market position while serving community needs. A win-win scenario, Olivia concluded with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Senator Thompson looked between them with barely concealed skepticism. Well, I suppose even titans of industry are embracing social responsibility these days. Sign of the times. After the senator moved on, Henry turned to Olivia. Thank you for that support. It was unexpected. I don't have to agree with you personally to recognize when you're making professional decisions I support, Olivia replied. The Brooklyn revision is genuinely better for the community. I won't pretend otherwise just because we're... She trailed off. At an impasse, Henry suggested. Something like that, Olivia acknowledged. A moment of genuine connection passed between them, quickly interrupted by the announcement that dinner was about to be served. They made their way to their assigned table, where they were joined by several other couples, including Charlotte and her husband. Throughout dinner, they maintained their cordial facade, participating in the general conversation while avoiding direct engagement with each other. Charlotte watched them with barely concealed curiosity, occasionally exchanging glances with her husband that suggested they were the subject of silent communication. After the main course, Henry excused himself briefly to speak with a business associate across the room. As he made his way back to the table, he paused, struck by the sight of Olivia, in animated conversation with Charlotte, her face illuminated by genuine laughter for the first time in weeks. The emerald of her gown caught the light as she gestured expressively, and Henry was suddenly forcefully aware of how much he had missed her. Not as a conquest or a challenge, but as herself, with all her passion and principles and sharp intelligence. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. This was no longer about winning a wager or securing a business advantage. Somewhere along the way, Olivia Vasquez had become important to him in ways he had never anticipated and wasn't entirely prepared to confront. Before he could process this revelation fully, the orchestra began playing, and couples moved toward the dance floor. Returning to the table, Henry hesitated, then extended his hand to Olivia. "Would you care to dance?" "For appearance's sake," he added hastily. Olivia regarded him for a long moment before nodding. For appearances. On the dance floor, Henry placed one hand lightly at her waist, while taking her hand with the other, maintaining a respectful distance between them as they began to move to the music. Despite everything, they fell into rhythm effortlessly, as if their bodies remembered the brief waltz they had shared at their first public appearance months ago. "I've been meaning to tell you," Henry said after a moment. "I've started the process of establishing a new publishing imprint focused on diverse voices in literature and journalism. Olivia missed a step slightly before recovering. And this is relevant because, Dika, it's modeled after your father's company, Henry explained. Not as a replacement. Nothing could replace what was lost, but as a tribute to his vision and legacy. Charlotte has been advising me on the literary direction. Olivia's eyes flickered to her friend across the room. So that's what those meetings have been about. You knew we were meeting. Charlotte doesn't keep secrets from me, Olivia said simply. Then you know this isn't just for show, Henry pressed gently. The imprint will have complete editorial independence and sustainable funding. I won't be involved in day-to-day operations or content decisions. Olivia was quiet for several moments as they continued to dance. Why are you doing this, Henry? Really? Henry considered his answer carefully. Initially, to make amends for a wrong my family committed. But now, I believe in the mission. The voices your father championed deserve to be heard, perhaps now more than ever. And it has nothing to do with winning me over, Olivia challenged, meeting his gaze directly. Would you believe me if I said no? Henry asked. Probably not, Olivia admitted with surprising candor, but I'm beginning to think your motivations might be more complex than I initially assumed. The music shifted to a slower tempo, and couples around them drew closer together. Henry and Olivia maintained their careful distance, though the charged atmosphere between them seemed to intensify. I miss our debates, Henry found himself saying. The Brooklyn project isn't the same without your incisive critiques. A ghost of a smile touched Olivia's lips. I'm sure your team is relieved to be free of my constant objections. On the contrary, they've started playing devil's advocate, raising points they think you would raise. Dr. Vasquez would question these traffic pattern assumptions, and so on. Olivia looked genuinely surprised. Really? Really? Henry confirmed. You made an impression. As the dance concluded, they remained on the floor a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them. Finally, Olivia stepped back. I should powder my nose before dessert, she murmured. Excuse me. Henry watched her go, fighting the urge to follow. Instead, he returned to their table, where Charlotte immediately took the seat beside him. That looked less awkward than I expected, she observed without preamble. We're adults capable of civility, Henry replied. Charlotte gave him a knowing look. It's more than civility, and you know it. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before Henry could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. Camilla Winters, the Society columnist who had overheard his original wager with Brian, was making her way directly toward their table, an expression of barely contained excitement on her face. Mr. Blackwood, she greeted him with predatory enthusiasm. Just the man I was hoping to find. I wonder if you might comment on some information that's recently come to light. Henry tensed. What information would that be, Ms. Winters? About your marriage, she continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Specifically, its origins as a wager between you and Brian Vasquez, a 6-month arrangement with financial stakes on both sides. Quite the story, wouldn't you say? Henry's blood ran cold. Where did you hear this? Sources close to the situation, Camilla replied vaguely. I'm working on a feature for Sunday's paper. I thought I'd give you the opportunity to provide your perspective before it goes to print. Henry's mind raced, calculating options and consequences. Ms. Winters, I'd appreciate the chance to discuss this privately. Perhaps we could arrange a proper interview tomorrow. I'm afraid my deadline is rather tight, she countered. Just a quick comment for now would be helpful. Was it true that you wagered $1 million against Brian Vasquez's stake in the Central Park West development that you could make his sister fall in love with you? The question hung in the air between them, and Henry became acutely aware of a sudden silence at nearby tables as guests strained to overhear. This was exactly the public revelation they had hoped to avoid, threatening not just their arrangement, but Olivia's dignity as well. Ms. Winters, Henry began, struggling to find words that might mitigate the damage, when a calm voice interrupted from behind them. Actually, the wager was my idea. Henry turned to find Olivia standing there, her expression composed, but her eyes blazing with determination. I beg your pardon? Camilla blinked in confusion. The arrangement began as my suggestion, Olivia continued smoothly, taking a seat beside Henry and placing her hand over his on the table. Henry and I had known each other peripherally through my brother for years. I had been studying the psychology of married couples for a research project and proposed a 6-month marriage experiment. Henry, being the businessman he is, structured it as a wager to make it interesting. Camilla looked between them skeptically. That's not the information I received. Gossip often distorts reality, Olivia replied with a dismissive wave. What began as an academic experiment evolved into something neither of us anticipated. She turned to Henry, her expression softening in a performance so convincing it made his heart ache. Sometimes the most unexpected arrangements lead to the most profound discoveries. Henry found himself momentarily speechless, awed by her quick thinking and unexpected defense. Recovering quickly, he lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. My wife prefers to keep our private life private, Ms. Winters, but suffice it to say, the wager is now irrelevant to our relationship. Camilla studied them, clearly trying to reconcile this version with her information. So the marriage is genuine now? Our arrangements are our own business, Olivia stated firmly. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe they're about to announce the fundraising total for the evening, which is, after all, the purpose of this gathering. Dismissed so definitively, Camilla had little choice but to retreat, though the speculative gleam in her eye suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. When she had gone, Henry turned to Olivia, keeping his voice low. "Thank you for that. You didn't have to intervene." "I wasn't about to let her humiliate you publicly," Olivia replied simply. "Despite everything, we're still in this together until our time is up." 3 weeks, Henry noted. Almost to the day. Something flickered in Olivia's eyes. Regret, uncertainty, before she masked it with practicality. "We should present a united front for the remainder of the evening, in case Ms. Winters is still watching." "Of course," Henry agreed, though the calculating part of him that had once viewed their marriage as merely a strategic objective had gone curiously quiet. They remained at the gala for another hour, maintaining their facade of marital harmony with renewed dedication. To outside observers, they appeared reconciled after whatever brief estrangement had kept them apart in recent weeks. Only they knew the complex reality beneath the performance. The drive back to Oakwood was less tense than the journey into the city had been, though a new undercurrent of uncertainty flowed between them. As they pulled up to the house, Henry turned to Olivia. "Would you prefer that I return to the city tonight?" Olivia hesitated, then shook her head. "No, that would seem odd if anyone is monitoring our movements. You should stay. Oakwood has plenty of room for us to maintain our distance." Inside, they paused in the entrance hall, suddenly awkward in the familiar space that had briefly been their shared home. "Thank you again for your intervention with Camilla Winters," Henry said. "It was unexpected." "We made an agreement," Olivia replied. "Public unity, private autonomy. I keep my promises." "As do I," Henry assured her. "Which is why I want you to know that the publishing imprint will proceed regardless of what happens between us when our arrangement ends. It's not contingent on your forgiveness or approval, though both would mean a great deal to me." Olivia studied him for a long moment. "You've changed, Henry." "Perhaps I needed to," he acknowledged. Another silence fell between them, filled with things unsaid. Finally, Olivia moved toward the stairs. "Good night, Henry." "Good night, Olivia." As she ascended, Henry found himself watching her with a mixture of emotions he couldn't entirely untangle. For the first time in his life, he had no strategic plan, no clear path to his objective. Because for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure what that objective was anymore. The following morning, Henry woke early and went for a long walk around the Oakwood grounds, trying to clear his head. The property was beautiful in early winter, with frost glittering on bare branches and evergreens standing in stark relief against the pale sky. He found himself at the maple tree, where he and Olivia had shared their first real conversation months ago, when she had been nothing more to him than a challenge to be conquered. How drastically things had changed since then. The woman he had considered plain and unremarkable now occupied his thoughts in ways no other ever had. Her principles, which he had once viewed as obstacles to overcome, now challenged him to examine his own values and actions. Most unsettling of all, her good opinion had become important to him, not as a means to winning their wager, but for its own intrinsic worth. Was this love? Henry wasn't sure. He had never been in love before, had always viewed romantic attachment as a weakness to be avoided in favor of clear-headed strategic thinking. Yet here he was, feeling more alive and more uncertain than he had in years, all because of a woman who had never wanted anything to do with him in the first place. Returning to the house, Henry found Olivia in the kitchen, making coffee. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair tied back in a casual ponytail, looking more relaxed than she had at any point during the previous evening's glamorous event. "Good morning," he greeted her, hesitating at the threshold. "Morning," she replied, surprisingly without the coolness he had come to expect. "Coffee? Please." Henry nodded, accepting the mug she offered and leaning against the counter at a respectful distance. They sipped their coffee in silence for a moment, before Olivia spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about the publishing imprint." "Oh?" Henry tried to keep his tone neutral, not wanting to pressure her. "I'd like to know more about it," she continued. "Not to judge or approve, but to understand. It was my father's legacy, after all." Henry set down his mug. "Of course. I have the full proposal in my study. Would you like to review it now?" Olivia nodded, and he led the way to his study, acutely aware of her presence behind him. This was the first time she had willingly entered his private space since their separation. Inside, he retrieved a leather portfolio from his desk and handed it to her. "The working title is Puentes Press, after your father's flagship magazine," he explained as she began to review the contents, "though that could change if you think something else would be more appropriate." As Olivia examined the detailed business plan, editorial mission statement, and initial author roster that Charlotte had helped assemble, Henry watched the play of emotions across her face. Surprise, thoughtfulness, and perhaps a hint of something like gratitude. "This is thorough," she finally said, looking up at him, "and surprisingly aligned with what I know of my father's vision." "Charlotte was instrumental in shaping that aspect," Henry acknowledged. "I wanted it to be authentic, not just a corporate gesture." Olivia closed the portfolio carefully. "What role do you envision for yourself in this venture?" "Financial backing and structural support only," Henry replied promptly. "Editorial decisions would rest with a board that includes people who understood your father's mission. I thought perhaps you might suggest some names." Olivia looked genuinely surprised. "You'd want my input?" "No one would be better qualified," Henry said simply, "though I understand if you'd prefer not to be involved." Olivia was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "I need to think about this. It's not what I expected." "Take all the time you need," Henry assured her. "As I said, this isn't contingent on anything between us. The imprint will move forward regardless." "Why?" Olivia asked suddenly, fixing him with an intent gaze. "And don't tell me it's just about making amends. There's more to it than that." Henry considered deflecting but found himself unwilling to be anything less than honest with her. "Because getting to know you has changed how I see things. The values your father championed, the ones you carry forward, they matter. They should have a platform. And how exactly has knowing me changed you, Henry?" Olivia pressed, taking a step closer. The question hung between them, demanding a level of vulnerability Henry had rarely allowed himself. But after everything they had been through, anything less than complete honesty felt inadequate. "You've made me question assumptions I've held my entire adult life," he admitted. "About success, about value, about what matters beyond the bottom line. You've made me see people, not just properties or opportunities, and most unexpectedly." He paused, gathering his courage. "You've made me care about your opinion in ways that have nothing to do with our wager." Olivia's eyes widened slightly at this admission. "That sounds dangerously close to actual feelings, Mr. Blackwood." "Terrifying, isn't it?" Henry agreed with a wry smile. "I assure you, no one is more surprised than I am." A moment of charged silence passed between them, both aware they were venturing into territory beyond their carefully negotiated arrangement. "I should go," Olivia said finally, handing him back the portfolio. "I promised Charlotte I'd meet her for lunch in the city." "Of course," Henry nodded, accepting the retreat for what it was. Not rejection exactly, but a need for space to process. "Will you be back for dinner?" Yes," Olivia decided. "Yes, I think I will." After she left, Henry stood in his study for a long while, uncertain whether their conversation represented progress or merely a temporary thaw. One thing was clear, however, with only 3 weeks remaining in their arrangement, The time for strategic games and careful maneuvering was past. Whatever was to happen between them now would have to happen honestly, without the pretense that had defined their relationship from the beginning. That evening they shared a quiet dinner, their conversation tentative but genuine. They discussed the publishing imprint further, with Olivia offering insights about her father's approach that helped refine the concept. They talked about the Brooklyn project, its evolution toward a model that balanced community needs with development goals. They even reminisced about some of their more spirited debates during the early weeks of their marriage. What they didn't discuss was the future, specifically what would happen when their 6-month arrangement concluded in just 3 weeks. The question hung silently between them, acknowledged but unaddressed. The following days established a new pattern. Henry divided his time between the city and Oakwood, while Olivia resumed some of her regular activities at the estate. They were neither fully reconciled nor actively at odds. Rather, they existed in a state of cautious détente, each wary of disrupting their fragile equilibrium. 2 weeks before their arrangement was set to end, Henry received an unexpected visit at his Manhattan office. He looked up from his desk to find Brian standing in the doorway, an inscrutable expression on his face. "Do you have a minute?" Brian asked, unusually formal. "Of course." Henry gestured to the chair across from him. "What's on your mind?" Brian settled into the chair but seemed in no hurry to speak, studying Henry with an intensity that was somewhat disconcerting. "I've been talking with Olivia," he finally said, "about the publishing imprint, about the Brooklyn revisions, about you." Henry waited, sensing there was more coming. "She seems different," Brian continued. "Less angry, more thoughtful. She's even defending some of your decisions to her activist friends." "That's good to hear," Henry replied cautiously. Brian leaned forward suddenly. "What are your intentions toward my sister, Henry?" The bluntness of the question caught Henry off guard. "I'm not sure that's any of your business at this point. You arranged this marriage, remember, set the terms, established the wager. And now I'm asking what happens when the wager period ends," Brian pressed. "Because it seems to me that things have evolved beyond our original agreement." Henry sighed, leaning back in his chair. "If you're asking whether I plan to hold Olivia to our arrangement or demand my prize if she's fallen for me, the answer is no. Whatever happens next will be entirely her choice. And if she chooses to walk away, then that's her right," Henry said simply, though the thought brought an unexpected ache. "I won't pretend these months haven't affected me, Brian. But I won't use that to manipulate her either." Brian studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You know, when I proposed this wager, I never actually expected you to win." "And now?" Henry asked. A smile touched Brian's lips. "Now, I'm not sure either of you is winning or losing. I think the game changed when we weren't looking." After Brian left, Henry found himself reflecting on their conversation. The game had indeed changed, or perhaps they had simply stopped playing. What had begun as a cynical wager had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, leaving them in uncharted territory with no clear path forward. The following weekend, their last full weekend before the 6-month mark, brought unexpected clarity. Henry returned to Oakwood late Saturday afternoon after meetings in the city to find Olivia in the library, surrounded by old photo albums and boxes of memorabilia. "Johnson found these in storage," she explained, when she saw him hesitating in the doorway. "Things my mother sent when Brian and I were settling my father's estate. I never had the heart to go through them properly." "Would you like privacy?" Henry offered, prepared to withdraw. "No," Olivia shook her head. "Actually, I'd appreciate the company. This is harder than I expected." Henry joined her on the sofa, maintaining a respectful distance as she showed him photographs of her father, a handsome man with Olivia's intense eyes and Brian's easy smile. Alberto Vasquez at his desk at the publishing house, surrounded by manuscripts. Alberto embracing his wife while a young Brian and tiny Olivia posed before a Christmas tree. Alberto at a book launch, proudly standing beside an author, whose first novel he had published against the advice of his editorial board. "He took chances," Olivia explained, tracing the image with her fingertip. "Not just financial ones, but creative ones. He believed in voices that others overlooked. Like father, like daughter," Henry observed quietly. Olivia looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You take chances too," Henry explained. "Standing up to developers with far more resources, championing causes others consider lost, agreeing to an insane marriage proposal for the sake of your environmental foundation. That takes the same kind of courage. A smile touched Olivia's lips. I never thought of it that way. I always figured I got my stubbornness from him, but not much else. You got his vision? Henry disagreed. His ability to see possibilities others miss. They continued through the albums, Olivia sharing stories of her childhood and early memories of visiting her father's office. As the afternoon faded into evening, Henry found himself drawn not just to the man in the photographs, but to the daughter who had carried his legacy forward in her own way. After dinner, they returned to the library, where Olivia had discovered a box of her father's personal correspondence. Among the letters was one addressed to her, apparently written during his final days but never sent. I can't, she whispered, holding the envelope with trembling hands. I don't think I can read this alone. Without a word, Henry moved to sit beside her, close enough to offer support but not presuming to touch her. Olivia drew a deep breath and carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the pages within. As she read silently, tears began to spill down her cheeks. Henry sat quietly, offering his presence without intrusion. Finally, she looked up, her eyes bright with emotion. He knew, she said softly. He knew the end was coming, and he wanted me to know that it wasn't about the business failure. He writes that what mattered was the work they did, the voices they amplified, the stories they told. He wanted me to remember that success isn't measured in dollars, but in impact. Henry felt a tightness in his throat. He sounds like a remarkable man. He was, Olivia nodded, and he would have... She hesitated, then continued. He would have appreciated what you're trying to do with the imprint, not because it erases the past, but because it honors the mission. Their eyes met, and in that moment something shifted between them, a barrier falling, a connection deepening. Without conscious thought, Henry reached out to brush a tear from her cheek. Olivia didn't pull away from his touch as she once might have. Henry, she said quietly, I need to ask you something important. Anything, he replied, his hand dropping back to his side. When our 6 months are up next week, what do you want to happen? The question he had been both anticipating and dreading hung between them. Henry considered his words carefully, knowing that this was no time for strategic calculation or half-truths. I want you to be happy, he said finally. Preferably with me, but ultimately that's your decision to make. If you choose to end our arrangement as planned, I'll respect that completely. The publishing imprint, the Brooklyn compromises, none of that changes. And if I don't choose to end it? Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's heart quickened. Then we start over. No wages, no arrangements, no pretense. Just us figuring out what this is between us, at whatever pace feels right. Olivia was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see right through him. I never expected this, she finally said. Any of it. I was so sure you were exactly who I thought you were, arrogant, ruthless, concerned only with winning. I was, Henry acknowledged. In many ways, I still am. I'm not claiming some miraculous transformation. But you've helped me see that there's more to aspire to than just accumulating wealth and power. And you've shown me that people can surprise you, Olivia admitted. That first impressions aren't always the whole story. They sat together in companionable silence, the weight of their shared journey settling around them. No decisions were made that night, no declarations exchanged, but something had shifted irrevocably. The performance had ended, leaving only truth between them. The final week of their arrangement passed in a strange, suspended state. No longer adversaries, not quite partners, something unresolved yet undeniably present between them. They attended a final public event together, their united front no longer requiring conscious effort. They shared meals and conversations at Oakwood, each interaction layered with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. On the morning that marked exactly 6 months since their wedding day, Henry woke early and went for a walk around the grounds. The winter landscape had softened with the first hints of approaching spring, crocuses pushing through the soil, buds forming on the trees, the quality of light changing subtly. Nature's reminder that endings often contained beginnings within them. When he returned to the house, he found Olivia waiting for him in the kitchen, 2 cups of coffee on the counter between them. 6 months, she said simply. To the day, Henry agreed, accepting the coffee she offered. Our arrangement has officially run its course. Olivia nodded, her expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about what happens next. And Henry tried to keep his tone neutral, despite the rapid beating of his heart. I think, Olivia began, then paused, reconsidering her words. No, I know that I'm not ready for this to end. Not like this, not as some business arrangement that's reached its conclusion. Hope surged through Henry, though he kept his expression carefully controlled. What are you saying, Olivia? I'm saying I'd like to try again, she replied, meeting his gaze directly. No wagers, no pretense. Just us seeing where this might lead. The simplicity of her statement belied its profound significance. This wasn't the culmination of his strategic campaign to win their wager. It was something far more valuable and more fragile. Are you sure? Henry asked, needing her certainty more than he needed her agreement. This isn't about the publishing imprint or the Brooklyn project or... It's about you, Henry, Olivia interrupted gently. The man who listened when he could have dismissed, who changed when he could have stayed the same, who saw value in my father's work when he had every reason to walk away. She moved around the counter to stand before him, closer than she had willingly come in months. I'm not saying I'm in love with you, I'm saying I think I could be given time. If that's not enough, Henry reached for her hand, entwining their fingers carefully. It's more than enough. It's everything. The kiss that followed was unlike their ceremonial peck at their wedding, tentative at first, then deepening with a certainty that surprised them both. When they finally drew apart, Olivia's smile held a teasing quality he had come to treasure. So who won the wager? She asked. Technically speaking. Henry laughed, the sound free and genuine. I think we both did. Though Brian will be insufferably smug about it. Let him be, Olivia shrugged, still not releasing his hand. He was right about one thing. Sometimes the most unexpected arrangements lead to the most meaningful connections. Outside the kitchen window, spring sunshine illuminated the grounds of Oakwood, the home that had witnessed their journey from adversaries to tentative allies to something with the potential for much more. The road ahead would not be without challenges. They were still fundamentally different people with divergent worldviews, but they faced it now not as opponents, but as partners, each made stronger by the other's perspective. And in New York, the first issue of Puentes Press's flagship magazine was being readied for publication, featuring voices that might otherwise have gone unheard. On its masthead, a simple dedication, in honor of Alberto Vasquez, who believed that building bridges between different worlds creates something stronger than either could be alone. Dear listeners, we hope that Henry and Olivia's journey has touched your hearts. Their story reminds us that true connection often emerges in the most unexpected places, and that people can surprise us and themselves when given the chance. For more captivating tales that explore the complexities of human relationships, we've prepared a special playlist of equally moving stories. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring unique narratives that delve into life's intricate dimensions. Don't miss our upcoming content. We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments section below.